En el nombre de MEXTRÓPOLI presentamos un diálogo que se hizo en conjunto con el Alen Institute. La plática se llama Habitando la ciudad, comunidades globales y espacio urbano. Miembros del Consejo Internacional del Alen Institute presentan una conversación sobre la forma en que ciudades y nuestra relación con el ambiente construido evolucionan a través del tiempo y lo que los arquitectos pueden hacer para entender mejor los nuevos entornos y comunidades en las que trabajan. Un poquito para comentarles qué es el Alen Institute. Es una organización sin lucro que se encuentra en Nueva York, que está dedicada a, pues, enteramente a estar en pro del diseño y de la arquitectura. Fue originalmente fundada en 1894 como una sociedad de las bellas artes y en el 95, en honor a William Van Alen, se le puso Alen Institute. El día de hoy vamos a tener a 6 muy interesantes ponentes, todos internacionales, entonces por ello es que afuera tenemos los aparatos para la traducción simultánea, y vamos a tener a Kai W. Bergmann, partner de Bjarke Ingels Group, que viene de Nueva York, Hana Kassem, director, Kohn Pedersen Fox, también de Nueva York, Sasa Radulovic, fundador de 5468-796 Architecture de Winnipeg, Herforth Nielsen, founder de 3XN de Copenhague, Carla Swickerath, CEO principal del estudio de Libeskind, situada en Nueva York, y como moderador, el director ejecutivo de Alen Institute, que es David van der Leer. Entonces, un aplauso para los ponentes. Gracias.
The one with a long wire. No. A very good evening, everybody. I'm David van der Leer, Director for Van Alen Institute. Before getting started, I should apologize for talking to you tonight in English. My Spanish is terrible. I think there's some better Spanish on the group here, but we decided to do this in English. And there is translation that is available. So if you don't have a headset yet, jump in for that. Thank you very much to MEXTRÓPOLI for hosting us here tonight and over the past days. I'm here with our group of international council members, and you see 5 of them, but there's actually many more, and many of them are in the audience tonight. So make sure to say hi, they're a fantastic group. Mariana for MEXTRÓPOLI already explained a little bit about what Van Alen is and what it does. I will add a few words to that, and then we'll also tell you more about the International Council. Van Alen Institute, as Mariana alluded to, started 122 years ago now in New York City. And these days, we're a design organization, a non-profit that tries to improve the cities and landscapes around us by creating good design competitions, helping cities and communities with research, and creating public programs. Without too much, or without jumping into all of that too much, our International Council is a group of very clever and creative designers, engineers, and people in related fields that we meet with twice a year. And we do that on trips around the world, usually once in the Americas and once elsewhere. This is our first trip for 2016. We've been here for a couple of days. And what we do on these trips is meet interesting people, have great discussions with them. So we had a fantastic discussion yesterday evening with a group. We see things in the city, ranging from great pieces of architecture to urban developments. And also importantly, of course, when you're out with a group of people, it's always great to hang out and also have a little bit of fun. But I'm sure you all understand that aspect also well. I'm going to ask each of the council members to quickly run through who you are. And we'll start with Kai there at the end. And tell us briefly who you are, where you're from, what you do. And very importantly, tell us one project that you're currently working on and that you are excited about. And then once we're coming back here, I will tell you a little bit more about the topic that I want to discuss with this group tonight. But first, over to the group. Kai.
So my name is Kai Uwe Bergmann. I'm a partner at BIG, or Bjarke Ingels Group. We have offices in New York and in Copenhagen. We work on a range of projects, both buildings, public spaces, and infrastructure. The project that I think is most interesting because it actually is connected with Van Alen. Van Alen also runs competitions and helps communities, institutions with thinking about how design can change people's lives. And one of those projects was the Big U in New York after the Sandy storm, which is thinking about 10 miles of the coastline of New York. I think most people would think that this is an impossible puzzle to solve. There are too many landowners, there are too many different public agencies that own the different pieces of the coastline, but we have managed to actually work with so many different people, hundreds of groups, to actually create the type of change that we need in order to protect ourselves for future climate events. So that's big in a nutshell.
It doesn't happen very often that you get big in a nutshell, right? But great.
Hello everyone, my name is Sasa Radulovic. I'm principal of Cinco, Cuatro, Seis, and so on. I'm an import. We're in Canada, in Winnipeg. I'm an import there. We run a small practice relative to big. Everybody's small, and what our practice got shaped around is a small, bite-sized housing projects, and every next one becomes a new challenge. And we're currently working on a piece of land that's allowing us to create a whole neighborhood. We have a chance to make something that's really interesting. We're sort of leaning towards the way of good ordinary is sort of the term that I like in the last 3 days, and we have a great chance to fuck it up as well. So it's going to be one or the other.
Hello, I'm Carla Swickerath, CEO and principal at Studio Libeskind. I'm in the New York office, but we have offices in Milan and Switzerland as well. Our office has followed a myriad of paths in different directions, and we've done from museums, major master plans, cultural institutions, commercial projects, retail, office, whatever seems interesting, I guess. When David asked to talk about one project that we're currently working on that's interesting, one that popped into my mind is a very modest, very small project at a university in Durham in England. And it's an Institute for Cosmology and Astrophysics. And these professors and students are cutting edge on thinking about the universe, the Big Bang, figuring out why we're all here. And they have been, by far, one of the most inspiring and best clients to work with. It's a small project, but they're actually going to be in their offices, have their meetings, and they're going to contemplate why we're all here and how we got here. And it always seems so exciting, and then they're a great, but they're just a really fun group of nutty professors, so it's been very inspiring to work on.
Hi, my name is Hana Kassem. I'm a director at Kohn Pedersen Fox. I'm based in New York, originally from Beirut. KPF has 6 offices worldwide: in London, Hong Kong, Shanghai, Seoul, and Abu Dhabi, where we're doing an airport. That's under construction. And so much like Carla, our office does quite a big range from master plan work to residential, hospitality, office space. One of the most exciting projects that I've come across is one that I'm currently working on, and is very unusual for our practice because it is recovery and resiliency project that is coming post Hurricane Sandy, which, as you all know, hit New York about 3 years ago. And it involves low-income housing, which is also very new to us and very challenging and very exciting. It's 32 buildings that are existing that were impacted by the hurricane. They've been on emergency generators for 3 years. This is about 9,000, at least 9,000 people. That's the amount that's documented, but there are more people living in those buildings. And so our project is kind of a multidisciplinary project that involves landscape as well as infrastructure and programming of spaces, community spaces, etc. And I think that that's been sort of a really fascinating project that I think is going to have a big impact.
Thank you.
You guys are really afraid of that microphone there, I think, right?
I didn't see it. I'm Herforth Nielsen, founder of 3XN from Copenhagen, and we work all over the world. One of the projects I'm going to talk about, what would be my interest is about is how architecture shapes behavior, and this is something that is in all, more or less all our projects now. And one of the latest projects we're doing is a high-rise in Sydney, where we took that subject up. Normally high-rises are more from the outside, and then you don't know what's on the inside. But the city here wanted a high-rise that could have impact on the street level as well, and animate a dead area close to the center in Sydney. So I thought that was a good challenge. Another thing was that there is an existing high-rise at the site, and they asked us to use as much as possible of the existing high-rise. So we are using 2/3 of the existing high-rise, only adding 2 more elevators to the core and doubling the amount of square meters in the building. And then we're doing another thing. We are doing what we call some vertical villages, where we're doing a series of atriums that comes up through the building, a series of volumes too that moves with the views up through the building, and looking down at on the opera. That's done by another Danish architect, by the way, Jørgen Utzon. And we're the only.
I hope your tower is not going to take that long, though.
No, Utzon, he's done what I don't think very many architects are going to do. He's done a symbol for an icon for a whole country, not only for Sydney, but from Australia. But we are saluting to his building in front of our building there, and it's a very exciting high-rise and a very exciting project that's hopefully is going to do something special for Sydney.
So great group of people, right? Very happy to have you all here, so thank you for making time. What we're very interested in at Van Alen Institute is trying to understand better how do we get impacted by the cities and the buildings that we live in on a day-to-day basis. I have a strong feeling that we don't know enough about that yet, and it's the reason why I've invited these 5 people to be here tonight to talk through these issues. Kim, of course, had an idea of where I was heading, so provided the perfect bridge for that, so I'm happy with that. I would like to ask you guys to pass on this one microphone here, and let's pass it to Sasha. The first question that I would like to put out is, when you first started making projects, or perhaps even much earlier, perhaps you were a teenager at that point, what was the first time that you realized, oh, the projects that we create as designers, we'll wait for him to get a microphone, good. The projects that we create as designers actually do have an impact on the people using it. When did you see that first, Sasha?
You told me that question, and I tried not to get prepared. Really, I tried to improvise, and now it's tough. I want to say, when I was a kid, I was taken to a church. The first time I come from Yugoslavia, communist country, nobody goes to church in countries like that. So we were taken in almost like tourists, and I think it was a cathedral. It was a Catholic cathedral in the middle of Sarajevo, and I was taken there by my nanny, and I could not believe the difference between the behavior of people outside the door and inside the door. And it's when it hits you right there is when you figure that out. I think I was 4 or something like that.
What was the difference?
What was the difference? Anything from quiet. Kai was talking about the church you went into this afternoon. The difference between the street and the market and the hubbub of everything, and then getting into a church where everybody's whispering if they're talking, right? And the churches were made, or cathedrals are made to make an impression. And of course, this sounds like a really washed out answer, but they're made to make an impression, and they certainly do, right? And then you realize that somebody had to muster that up. Somebody had to think that out, and it was an architect or a master builder.
So was it because it was a religious building, or do you think it was because of the building?
Well, I don't know, because again, I've never been to a religious building before then, right? And so everything, I think it was everything together that made an impact. And then I remember asking to go back, and my parents were like, "Nope, you don't have to go back there," and so on. So I remember asking to go back.
Have you been back ever? No.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, good.
I've been to 2 more churches.
It's actually funny, my sister, to stay on the churches for a moment. Whenever we were going on holiday trips with a family, my father had this fetish for churches, I think. So we saw so many churches. My sister just refused to go in. Interesting. A very rebellious sister I have. Let's jump over to Hana for a second. Hana, when was the first time that you realized, like, okay, there's actually a great potential to design? And was it perhaps the reason why you became a designer?
Yeah, again, going back to childhood experiences, I was about 11, and at that point in time, we happened to live in Iraq, in Baghdad, and we traveled into the desert to visit some archaeological sites, and we came upon this, or we went to this really large palace that was sunken in the middle of the desert, and the heat outside of the desert, where we were, was just unbelievable heat, like a sauna. And you went down, this was a sunken courtyard, and you went down into it, and you literally needed a sweater. And again, this impression of this amazing space that was so simple and so quiet, and yet, kind of like this experience of coming out of the market into the church, it was that radical of a change that there's this silence, this coolness, this serenity. And I felt like, wow, this is a mixture of art, science, engineering, all of it coming together, creating this very special place. And I think it made a huge impact on me.
Have you ever had a chance to create a project in such a difficult context where temperature plays such a giant role?
Yes, actually, come to think of it, I don't think that it was that radical, but I did a project in Miami where it's very beautiful out, but it's also very humid and very hot. And even though you want to stay outside, you kind of can't sometimes. So we created this courtyard that with some water features, and we formed the buildings in such a way that they channel the winds or the breeze to pass over the water and cool the space of the courtyard. And it is significantly cooler. It's like maybe almost 10 degrees cooler in the feeling of it. So it makes for a pleasant place to be. So not as radical as the desert experience for sure, but yes.
See, it's nice to hear always a little bit about what makes people tick as designers. Carla is nodding. It's like, oh, it sounds like you may want to add one there also. Otherwise, I would jump to the second question. But yeah,
I was nodding because I always agree with you, David. But no, I think it's interesting because all of us kind of went back when the question was asked to something from childhood, something that made you change or feel the difference. And I had the fortune of having an architect as a father. And he was a very eccentric, unusual, noble, kind, and creative human being. I thought all architects were like that. It's not true. My dad was special. But he actually, I grew up in a small town in Florida, which was not a very inspired place as far as architecture is concerned. And my dad actually designed our elementary school. And it was before I actually went to school. So before my kindergarten year, he was designing our elementary school. And this was in the 70s, when there was an idea that schools should be designed like prisons, right? There was an equality where they had to have no windows, big concrete, you might know from growing up here, But my dad argued with the school board vehemently, my children are going to have windows in their classrooms. And it was like the biggest debate. It was a radical departure. He made everybody angry, but we had beautiful windows, clear stories. Everywhere there were windows, the most beautiful light in this very modest elementary school. So
amazing. I hope that many people here had family members like that in their past that inspired them to become architects or want to become architects.
But ironically, it took me a while to become an architect.
Oh, well.
it just was in the DNA. It was going to come out.
So it's interesting, right? These are anecdotes, and it's often about an intuitive feeling that you have that space has a big impact on who we are and how we behave. But then for me, it's also interesting when you're starting a project, an actual project in your studio. How do you set up for that? How do you allow yourselves to imagine what is the behavior of people going to be that are using your projects? It's one thing to create something that looks fantastic in a drawing, but I think it's actually much more important to figure out, like, okay, what happens after that when the drawing becomes reality and people are moving in? I'm going to throw this out to the group, see who answers. But yeah, how do you set up for imagining what is the behavior of people using your projects?
If I can start here, coming a little bit back to the question before, because the first building that really did something for my thinking about how, and really where I realized that building and the shape can actually shape behavior for the people inside was a high school that we designed. And we did about 20 different models where we tried to work with different forms inside. It was a high school, by the way, without classrooms. That was the whole idea about having a learning environment, a learning space in 5-story high without classrooms. And it's all about interaction between the students and learning from each other. So we tested a lot of different models about how can these shapes make people interact, and how can we make these people, the students, learn from each other. It's very much about visual contact too. And then we put a big staircase in the center of the building. And that staircase made people walk up and down, of course, but they make people, when they are close to the staircase and on the staircase, communicate in a different way. So we learned a lot from that space, and that was actually the driving factor of our architecture since then. And every building that we've been doing, we always think about how can the floor plates, how can the spaces interact, because if they interact, people interact as well.
So I think that's a really interesting one, right? A school without classrooms, I wish I would have gone to that one. How does it work? Like, is it just because of difference in floor height that people, that there's no noise interruption between the different, there's still classes, I guess.
There's still classes, yeah. There is some enclosed spaces, but with glass partitions for chemistry and for music, of course, it is enclosed as well. But most of the work between the students are formed in groups or individuals, and they find their own space. It's one big space, but it has different. It has a diversity in sizes. It's some boomerang shapes that turned around in a spiral form, so you get very tall spaces, lower spaces, and small spaces, more intimate spaces. So the students can find their own space and their own how they feel comfortable in working. And then there's the teachers are more tutors that come around and advises and go into discussions with the students. And of course there's a lowered sound environment in there, but still if somebody yells loud, everybody else is disturbed in there. And that's why I say it shapes behavior, because the students after a while, in the beginning they're fairly loud. They're 14, 15 years old when they come in there, but very soon they discover that they have to be a little bit more quiet and respect the others, and after a short time everybody is respecting each other and they work together.
So this makes me think you're thinking about the elements of the building that you're creating that could shape the behavior, right? So you're talking about the forms that could go into it, the relationship between those forms and so on. And this is again to the group. If you're setting up for that and you're starting to play around with these things, do you ever call somebody in that you ask, like, okay, perhaps it's somebody from the social sciences or psychology, or for that matter, that helps you think through these things? Because yes, we know these things often intuitively, but it's great to get a little bit of advice here and there, right?
I think we use our clients very often. One of the things that there's two things that I want to mention in this context. One of them is, one is personal, one is actually about methodology. My personal thing is every time there's a new project, I have a picture of what it should be. And we use that, or I use that as a measuring tool. Further we get from that picture, the better the project is, right? So I'm always assuming we're completely wrong. And but the project or the process is not unlike fishing. And you put things out and try to get information out of it, right? And sometimes that information comes from our accountant, right? And sometimes it comes out from a client or from a janitor and so on. So it's partially fishing and it's partially buying time as you're going through the design process, because you don't want to commit way too early. And so these two things feed back to it, and allowing yourself to think about what you're doing and allowing yourself to be influenced by people that see it. I think that's the magic of being an architect, because you're creating things that are unique for every situation.
And that's a good thing, right? Especially for the students in the crowd, there is a lot of magic to it, and that's why you all want to do this. Hana, it looks like you have something to push in.
Yeah, I think you know, for me, like I almost start with how I imagine people interacting in that space. So it's almost like a cinematographic way of thinking about it. And then from there, the architecture becomes almost like an infrastructure or a background for stuff to happen. And like, for example, a project that we did in Harlem at the City College of New York, lab buildings. The scientists, they used to work in this lab building where each lab was isolated and siloed and sort of opaque. You never saw from one space to the other, and you got lost in there, actually, because there's just this circulation. And the building that we designed from them is a total opposite of that, to the point that now they've turned the building into their sketchbook, or we call it sketchbook, their marker board. Like, the glass of the building on the interior, they're writing their formulas on it, they're collaborating, they see each other's labs. Again, this idea of the staircase you mentioned is so important, because when people, without planning formally to meet, run into each other, that's when stuff happens. Like, that's when these ideas start to come out, and they start to think about, oh, it doesn't matter, he's a chemist, I'm a physicist, we're working on the same project, we have a topic, you know. And it's amazing to see that design can make that change, which then, in this case, would translate into, you know, advances in science that have bigger repercussions.
Kai, Hana's comment makes me think about, you sometimes create projects and you have no clue about the strange things that could be happening in them. Kai always has great stories, so I have a hunch that you probably have a building that's led to surprises down the road. What had you never expected to be happening in one of your buildings?
I think it's not even a building. I think if you look at the first project that Bjarke was doing, it's the smallest project in the office. It's a bathing platform in the center of Copenhagen Harbor. And it's 200,000 euro. So it's also about, I think, that you don't need to have large budgets. You don't need to have all of this kind of, process, that you could, in very simple and in very small ways, change a city in a very major way. So what this bathing platform did is that for 100 years, the water in Copenhagen was too dirty to swim in. It was filled with sewage, it was filled with pollution, and no one wanted to live by the water. Everyone moved away from the water. So the city decided, we are going to clean the water. And they spent 10, 15 years really going through all kinds of means. Then they had a competition for all architects to come up with the best bathing platform. This bathing platform was to change the people's perception of what the water was. It was now something that you wanted to go to. And so there wasn't actually any history or anyone that could say what this bathing platform would be in the center of the city. But within, I would say, looking at how people move through the city, all of the pathways that led up to the edge of the harbor, we just literally extended those same pathways, and the bathing platform became a series of 3 different pools, one for children, one for adults, and one to sort of swim laps in. And so it became this kind of cross-generational kind of everyone in the city is welcome to now enjoy the water. And it was, again, $200,000 that the city had to just spend. And I think that's a kind of project that I think is extremely powerful, because we had no idea how the city would actually accept it.
And I think the beauty is now of Copenhagen that it's all so clean, the water, right, that you guys are actually swimming in the city. Yeah, amazing. I'm from Holland, as you can probably tell from the accent. No dream I would ever get into the water in our city. So we have to learn something from the Danes these days on water issues, which the Dutch government is not going to forgive that comment, I fear. Good. So, Kai, jumping off from that comment, if a project is done, and this is again to the whole group, how do you actually measure what is happening? Of course, your clients have all of these ways of measuring, like their success and is the building efficient and all of these things. But you also want to know, like, is this building doing what I was imagining it doing to the behavior of people in it? What do you do after a project is over? How often do you go back? And with what tools do you go back to a project?
So I'll start here again by just saying that in the 1960s and 70s, there was actually a lot of time spent looking back at how buildings were used. It was a time of sort of psychology and architecture actually meeting. And there was a term called post-occupancy evaluations that were very, very important, because those kind of evaluations of the people who were using the projects then informed how the next project would be built. I think that the tide changed again in the 80s and 90s and 2000s, that we don't place the same value on actually retaining that knowledge or getting that knowledge, yet it's becoming increasingly easy to actually access what people are doing, both in our buildings and in the spaces, through looking at how data, big data, is being used by cities. So I think it's a really great moment where big data and our buildings and spaces could once again be a more important tool for designers and urbanists to actually think about how to design cities.
And I had not set up for this, and I'm not sure if you even know this, but I'm very interested in this period, the behaviorism period, which especially in American schools was a very popular period, and then basically evaporated as soon as the end of the 80s these came around. And I think there is a beauty to learning from that period. One of the things that I have been wondering, and I wasn't actually planning on asking you any of this, but I have the feeling that we can measure things so much better these days than we could then. So then you could be standing on a street corner and tracking basically how many people walk over a plaza and in what directions and so on. These days we can actually do much more. We have the tools of technology that are helping us to go much, much further. Do you see that as a way, or do you see that as a potential for some of the thinking about behaviorism coming back? And is it something that is good? Or is it something that is perhaps a little bit scary?
Can I start a little bit back with the
Go
question
ahead.
before? Again, because we have a research department, GXN, green, G for green, and Nielsen is the end, by the way. But we hired, 4 years ago, we hired an architectural psychologist to do what you're talking about, to go out and investigate and look at our building, evaluate our buildings again. And this school I talked about before was one of the projects. She was looking into 5 of our buildings and see, do we really walk the talk? Do they work? And come out with and she's now coming out with a report about it.
Is she hired by you or is she independent?
No,
And I mean,
she's hired by us. Yeah, yeah, she's hired by us in our research department, and we got her sponsored, by the way, by a big foundation, because it's for an architectural office. It's difficult to pay for these kind of things, so you have to get a sponsor in to pay for it, and that's how we did it. So this report is going to be public report. That's not only for us, so that this foundation is going to send out for anybody to see it afterwards. So that's an interesting thing. Yeah.
So I'm going to ask Kim for that report, and you can find it on our website then. Yeah. That was just a plug for our website. Yeah. But let's see, is there anybody else that wants to jump in on the tools that you may be using to measure the buildings that you, and by the way, urban projects that you may have created, and perhaps jumping off on that point, like, are we excited about this?
I think maybe I have a slight counterpoint, perhaps, but I think we all know that we can measure the building success by the success of the company or how many visitors come to a museum, et cetera, et cetera. But I also think that we believe that architecture communicates, that we're really trying to say something to people, right? And so when I think of something like the Jewish Museum in Berlin, which was incredibly controversial, difficult to build, actually communicated a lot to a lot of people. And it actually spoke to people, and the response of the people that visit that museum from when it was just completed or still under construction to now, I think is a measure of success, which may not be quantifiable as you know, some kind of data-oriented thing, but it's more emotional. And that the building, which started in the competition, which was an open competition, started as a department for the Jewish department to the Berlin History Museum. It was an extension to an existing Prussian building that was housing the history of Berlin. And Daniel's proposal from the beginning was, you can't departmentalize a culture. You can't say, here's the Jewish department of the Berlin History Museum, right? They're all Berliners too. Was Einstein a Jew or German? You know, it was both. So I think that the fundamental concept of the project was to expand the idea, the premise of the museum. And in the end, after multiple government changes and cancellations of the building and then restarting of the building and multiple directors, in the end, the whole museum is now the German Jewish History Museum, 2,000 years of German Jewish history. The Berlin Museum has moved, so the whole institution became kind of tackling that topic. And I think that's a measure of success when an architect's idea can actually help influence the direction of the building. And
Hana, Carla doesn't realize that she is basically putting the title on this section, and she did the same thing yesterday. That's why I came up with this title, or she did yesterday. We had a long discussion yesterday with our council members as well as guests from the city here, experts from the city. And Hana, at the end of the discussion, said, like, okay, there's actually two things that are happening, right? On the one side, design changes us, and that's what you're talking about now. And it can be on the level of architecture, or it can be on the level of the city. On the other side, it's also people changing design and people changing the city. We'll get back to that point in a minute. I wonder if there's any more on the measuring stuff that is happening. I know, Sasha, perhaps there's one project you want to talk about.
Well, there's multiple projects to talk about. One interesting thing, and I think that many architects actually get into sort of typology and get to work in typologies. And we've been out for about 9 years now and have done about 15 three-story housing projects that have each one of them being different, and each one trying to do something else. And each one of them is a testing ground when it comes to ownership, when it comes to economy, when it comes to social condition, when it comes to the ways ownership works, the history behind the site, and so on. And so, what we find out as architects is we have a relatively small, relatively important role to play, or a relatively small impact, because all of the other things play in there. And some of you, I hope, will disagree with that. Anyway, our name was dragged through the mud a couple months ago about a housing project that wasn't researched quite well, and so on. And I don't need to go into that. You guys can research that yourself.
The project was researched well, right? The article wasn't researched well.
That's what I'm trying to say. Thanks, David, for clarifying that. The So the research is critical, and typology. The reason I'm bringing typology is the working within the same typology allows you to test things and use that as research, use that as a feedback mechanism back to what you're doing. Whether it's houses, whether it's a little sheds, or not too many bathing platforms, I guess. But the other thing that we're engaging into is we're trying to do our own post-occupancy reviews, right? And being a small practice, being in a small city, we get a lot of word of mouth, as well as going there and ask questions. I like Kim's methodology, which was to get somebody outside of the office involved, because that's our biggest obstacle as we show up on people's doorsteps and say, hey, what do you think about our building? Do you hate it or love it, right? And what are they going to say? So we're trying to hone down the ways to ask the right questions.
Hana, what happens on the KPF side with basically post-occupancy evaluation?
Well, I think it's different if it's a building that's done for public or for speculative use than if it's a building that's done for a specific user. And well, I have two examples. One of them, there was no problem. The person that I reached out to is a law school, and my brother is a lawyer in that law school, so he had no problem telling me exactly what was wrong with the building and what worked. Too much honesty, but it was very useful. But on the other hand, I think maintaining a relationship with your client, if it's a specific user group or a specific client, is a great thing. And following up, staying in touch 5 years down the road, 10 years down the road, and understanding, what things are working, what things are flexible enough that this building can have a life of its own, and when the building starts giving back and transforming the community that are serving, that's very rewarding. So I kind of agree a little bit with Carla in that I'm not so sure that it can be measured so much in terms of data in a scientific fashion, but I think the kind of person-to-person investigation is a good one.
And even just one more thought on that we literally talk about, because often we do buildings that can be sometimes traumatic or unusual in the setting that you're in. And we always see at the opening, what are the kids doing? And the kids are running up and down the stairs, jumping, having a good time. The adults might be going. But you think, okay, the future, it's like politics, right? Or that you look to the next generation and you hope that they are hearing your hearing what you're saying.
Actually, and perhaps we can jump briefly with that to Kim on the school building. So with that school building, and I've not been in the building, but I've seen photos of the building, and I've heard you talk about it. I hope the teenagers were not jumping up and down as Carla's kids in other projects were. But how was the response in the building of the teenagers? Did they have to get used to it, or how did it work?
I actually have a son that gone to the school, and he's okay. So he graduated too, and there I really got the direct response for how does it work. But the staircase is so important. It's not only at the staircase, but it's actually more entering the staircase. That is the stand and talk. The staircase becomes a mean for interaction, but also for exercise too, because it's 5-story high. So, and they walk up and down 5 times a day, so they get fit after a while. In the beginning, they complain about it. After a while, it's okay. It really, they're happy about it. Now he's been there for 10 years. And we can see that it's still working, and they haven't changed anything on the inside. The kids are sliding down the staircase because we made the handrail as a double handrail, so they couldn't tip over. So they can slide on the inside, and then they slide all the way down on the handrail.
Sounds like a school we should have all gone to, right? Sadly, I definitely didn't. We're going to make a jump in skill, mainly, actually. So we've been talking a lot about your build projects, your buildings. And I'm interested in talking a little bit about cities as well. Van Alen Institute is incredibly invested in city work. All of you are very interested in it and often doing city-related projects also. And before we take that skill jump, one brief intermezzo, so to say. is a project that we're currently running at Van Alen, looking at how the city may be impacting behavior. Is a tricky one, actually. So in London, we have been working now for roughly 8 or 9 months with Imperial College and a neuroscientist at King's College, trying to figure out, is there a relationship between addictive behavior, so addictions, and the city that they're taking place in? So do you generate certain behaviors because of the layout of the city? Big topic, complicated topic, makes people incredibly uncomfortable. So we're not necessarily going to talk about it, but I think it's important to have this type of thinking in the back of your mind while we're running through some of these other questions. So having that said, I want to make a jump. So we were talking about how your projects change the behavior of the people in them, right? But I think it's also very important to think of projects as a way to draw audiences in, to make people in the city realize that they actually are part of making that city, of changing that city. So that's the second part of the conversation that I would like to focus on, or the topic for the second part. My first question in this realm is, and we've been chatting about it quite a bit in the past days, is like if you're looking at projects that may not have started in an office, not in a design office, but that somebody in a street may have decided, like, okay, I'm going to do something here, and it may actually be a great change. How do you look at these projects as designers? Do you feel these projects out, and do they find a way back into your work somehow?
Maybe I'll start in that. Actually, this is what Hana said you have to talk about, so I'm gonna talk about my business partner as and the member. It's about engaging into political side of things as architects, and we are learning more and more. In a smaller city, we're a city of 750,000 people. So in a smaller city, it's pretty much every project that you do that stands out changes the landscape, and that's actually quite powerful place to be in, or quite powerful place to practice. And so regardless of scale and so on. So that just this past summer, Johanna has the tendency to create these money-losing projects, and so she's on her 4th or 5th one. This past summer, she did a project called Share Your Idea, where it was a sort of a analog Kickstarter thing where people were supposed to submit their urban ideas and donate or give $25 and write their idea on a chair and put a chair out in a public realm. So it disturbed all kinds of shit, but we got mayor behind it, and they tried to charge us for permits for these chairs that were starting to appear everywhere around the city, and so on and so on. And the winning idea that was juried afterwards by architects and decision makers is going to get implemented. And so that's one part of our practice, which tries to sort of prod the environment, prod the city. Way we learned about it.
Before you jump into that, I do want to jump in for Johanna. I think it's very important to do these projects, and I'm sure Sasha is going to explain us exactly why now.
It's absolutely critical, and the energy that feeds back to our office, energy that feeds back to architectural community, energy that allows us architects to get to the table with decision makers, which you don't get to do through individual projects, is tremendous, and that's sort of spreading like a capillary through the city and through the profession.
Good. So that's a great example, actually, and it's a good one, but it's in your office. And would like to see if there's anything that you are seeing out there that you would love to incorporate in your work in some shape or form, or would you just love to start seeing people do things that you cannot do in the practice?
I think if you look at America, you may think that it's all about growing, and it's all about production, and it's all about getting bigger and better. But actually, there's another real storyline in America, which is that there are a lot of cities that are actually that are shrinking, and that are have sort of gone past their peak. One of these is, of course, Detroit, the city that was the 3rd largest city in America at one point, and is, when you go there now, is just a sort of smattering of abandoned buildings and empty lots. And I think that we have a similar project in Pittsburgh. Pittsburgh was a steel town and peaked in the 1930s and 40s. where steel was sort of high, and has shrunk. And it's really remarkable when you think of these kind of peaked cities, and cities that have kind of lost a certain soul and are looking for what is the next kind of, what is the next chapter. And I see it here in Mexico City as well when I go to places, the immense layers of, you know, the first culture, the second culture, the third, and I think other cities like Los Angeles have this same multi-layeredness. So what we've learned in Pittsburgh is that many of the things that are most successful is actually grassroots efforts. These are abandoned lots that turn into gardens, urban farms in a way. So you're in the middle of the city in Pittsburgh, but suddenly there's a patch of tomatoes or potatoes being grown. And it is kind of recycling this idea of maybe a public space could be a string of informal gardens, or a public space can reinforce things that are occurring by these citizen groups. So suddenly, urbanism is actually grown not out of a plaza or out of a square, but actually through connecting all of these urban improvements that are occurring on a community level. And that's what our master plan in Pittsburgh actually kind of typifies.
I like it briefly. I like what you're saying here, and Kai knows me decently well, and also knows that I'm sometimes tired of another urban gardening project. But what I think is interesting about this is like what can happen when you start scaling things up. And that's, I think, what you're getting at, right? So there's a value to one project, and it's often to the direct neighbors and the people living around it. But what can you do with these projects, and can you blow them up to such a scale that they actually start making sense at the level of the city? But anyway, I think Hana had a point that you also wanted to jump in with.
Well, I think it ties to what you're saying quite a bit, in that a lot of times one of the first readings that I would have, let's say we're working on an urban scale, or even at the campus of a university scale of that, which is, you know, in some ways a microcosm of a city, in some ways. And I look for the way that students or inhabitants of that campus are using it, rather than what its areas, how they're supposed to be used. But actually, you learn a lot more through reading how students are cutting through, how they're certain paths that were not designed, how they're using certain areas in a way that they were not intended to be used. And that gives you a key as to what's needed and what this culture is about. It's a very, very apparent way. It's like very visible. Immediately you understand, oh, this is what's needed. And talking about scaling it up, and I think this is what you're mentioning as well. So being able to absorb that as, you know, an element that may be needed, and then extracting it into a scale that can translate, you know, at the level of a city, or, you know, more of an urban planning thing. So that's kind of an interesting way, I think, of reading a place, is through this grassroots sort of do it your own. Like, for example, this Red Hook project, talking about chairs. There are no benches really to speak of. There are a couple. There's no places for people to sit in this 32 building area, low income housing. The reason is because when those were built, they didn't want people to get together. This was deemed as being dangerous. For example, the lobbies are tiny. There are no lobbies. You just go in and go up to your apartment. That's it. So everything is being done so people don't get together. But in this large space, there are 3 wooden chairs that are placed in a giant green space. And I asked, you know, the person walking us around, so what is with this? Oh, those are the 3 elderly of the community. They get together here every single day at 4 p.m. and they watch. They observe what's going on in the, you know, in their neighborhood. that gives you a clue as to what needs to happen. Right?
I think, Carla, let's...
Yeah, I mean, just to really change the scale of this discussion, and I think it's a really important one, and actually a way that we even got involved in a project. As you all know, after 9/11, there was a lot of debate and discussion about what should happen. And I think for me, as an architect, I was living in Berlin at the time, I was extremely excited that for once I felt in America, everyday people were talking about what should be there. And they were talking about how architecture mattered and urban design mattered. And very interestingly and expectedly, the New York City state and government, and I won't list all the agencies and the people involved, but they put together some development agencies and they hired some spectacular urban designers and put together some plans. And they were all very good plans. I don't think in principle there was something wrong with any of them, but they presented them to the public. And because of the public interest, there was a huge convention with thousands of people came to this convention and saw these plans. And they were unilaterally rejected, right? And so, again, I wasn't working on the project at the time. We never, we were watching it as closely as everybody else was around the world. And I thought, wow, what an empowerment of the people. And obviously that moment and that catastrophe was so significant that it was an opportunity where people really felt that they should say something. People would say, build the towers as they were. Don't build anything. So it was really great. And that whole episode actually led the agencies to have a competition, which wasn't even a competition. It was supposed to be a design study where they invited people to apply, hired some architects to give some different ideas. And so for me, that was always an incredibly inspiring process. And then that continued throughout the entire master plan development, that kind of public involvement and government involvement.
So this is basically an excellent example, right, of how people also have a major impact on how the city can be developing, and then how the city can start changing us moving forward. Sasha, you wanted to jump in, it looked like, earlier on.
Well, I don't know how I follow this up, but there's a relatively small public agency back in Winnipeg that takes care of the most important tourist attraction in the city. They're right at the intersection of two rivers, and few years back, I think 7 or 8 years back, they decided to clear the rivers. Our temperatures get to about -40 in winter, and what's interesting, once the rivers are not navigable, nobody claims ownership over them. Once they melt, then the federal government owns the rights to rivers. But when they froze, it becomes no man's land. So they started clearing it up 1 year, and got a hockey rink going and a little skating trail. The next year, they got a longest skating trail in the world, which was 22 kilometers. And the following year, a group of architects decided to build 5 what we called warming huts. They were as far from warming as it gets, but they were huts nonetheless. And and placed them along that trail. And the reason I'm bringing this up is that the non-architect initiated event has led to something where we now have 20 huts. We had Frank Gehry do one. We had Anton Predok do one. And I think we're moving into Michelle Roykin did one last year. They were there nailing shingles into these wood beams at -30 degrees. That was a spectacular experience for those guys. And we've developed the entire tourist attraction developed around the warming huts. Today we see more visitors on that site in winter than we do in summer. So the entire thing has turned around the way the city is looked at. So the next year it appears it's going to be Anish Kapoor if everything goes well. So it's becoming international in many ways than one.
I hope he's not going to patent your or make sure that only he can use the hut. I'm not sure if you saw that news, but there's now a black pigment out that only Anish Kapoor can use for his artwork. I'm not sure what to think of that, but it's a side note. I want to jump scale again. So we started at the city scale, at the smaller scale, right? Looking at informal elements and how can they find their way into bigger projects. Something that came up in a larger discussion yesterday, I thought was actually very interesting as a next item in this discussion. Yes, those informal things can be super interesting, inspiring, leading to interesting work. But is there still a value to planning? Perhaps Kim, you want to jump in?
It definitely is. First of all, the biggest problem in many cities are cars and transportation, mobility. But the cars are really obstructing the city for interaction, for life between the buildings. So and this is something you can only plan yourself out of. So plans are very important. There's a movement here that we realized here in Mexico City for the pedestrians. And it's funny to see, because the first couple of days here we've been around Mexico City and seen nothing but cars in all the streets, and it's been dangerous just to cross the streets. And then we came to this area. There's completely pedestrian, and there's a lot of life there. And there's a lot of activity, retail, completely different area. But I know that's. I wonder, is that planned, by the way?
I don't know. It's a good question. Perhaps somebody in the audience can answer it.
But anyway, it needs to be planned for the cars, because else the cars takes over the city and take out all the nerve of the city. And of course, there has to be other kinds of rules and plans, for else others will just make plans for instead of the planners. I think that's important. Yeah.
So, coming from this answer, right? If there is a value to planning, what is also the role that governments need to play in this?
I think what it comes down to is leadership. And I think the leadership can exist in government, it can exist in the private sector, it can exist in nonprofits, in grassroots. I think we're humans, we work in groups. We need good leadership that will provide visions that people can believe in and that are implementable, that have the phasing and the kind of the eco and socio sort of dimensions to them. And when we see things breaking down, like Flint, Michigan, for example, where...
I think you need to explain that.
Yes. Flint, Michigan, like Detroit, very close by, or like other cities, has a crumbling infrastructure because there is no longer money being spent to keep things going. So the water quality is so poor that lead is inside the water and has made people sick and children and so forth. So this is a situation of, this isn't leadership today. This is leadership 20 years ago, 10 years ago, making decisions that placed emphasis on one part of the city or one part of the industry or whatever over something else. I think there is just that you have to seek people that have values, that share a value system with yourself, and you need to make those decisions. And some decisions are very difficult to make. So you can either clean up a mess like Flint, Michigan right now, and spend a lot of energy and resources. I think the carpenter says it best. You probably know this also in Spanish. You measure twice and you cut once. Or you measure once and you cut twice. So this simple thing that a carpenter lives by is, I think, something that planning is to architecture. Architecture is measuring twice. It's thinking about what we're doing in our cities, and then when we're actually implementing those plans, they're on a very good way or into the right direction.
Nice one, Kai. Let's see what else can come after that. So if you're looking at leadership, I do want to jump back briefly to government, right? Do you feel that there's perhaps sometimes a need for different ways of running of governments? Would there be a benefit to increase cross-agency collaboration, which I think yes. Perhaps one of you has a thought about that from a personal context of where you're living, perhaps.
I'll go to a city in Canada, Edmonton, where in Canada, transportation usually leads the city planning decisions. And there's very little city planning happening in the cities. It's mostly having to do with transportation and how quickly can you get cars from A to B. And we as we architects want to slow down the cars. We don't want to get them quickly from A to B, but that's a different thing. So in Edmonton, they have a very progressive mayor. So they've just fired the transportation manager and then put the transportation together with the parks people and with pedestrian people and people they're dealing with all aspects of the city, and said, now you work together. And they're totally pissed off, right? Because they used to have be in a driver's seat, and now they're off of that. So that is sort of a great example. I think our city has just set up a task force to figure out where they can do that. Do you have any idea how old the planning discipline is? Our desire to plan.
Nice question. You probably have to answer yourself.
Do I? Well, I'll put it back to a couple hundred years, but we have thousands of years of things preceding actual planning. And I always wonder, whenever we get into we architects love to order things, whether it's structure or some sort of upper or higher order. We love to solve things and put a meaning into them. And I often ask myself is what is the least we can do to and I'm guilty of all of that, or we're guilty of all of that. So, but what is the least you can do to just prod things to happen, right? I'm mesmerized by the fabric of this city. We talked a bit about the grain. I guess it's mostly architects, so we know what we're talking about when it comes to grain of the city. And I'm mesmerized by the amount of innovation that happens on small parcels of land. Like we visited today the Alberta Kalash's office, which is all about innovation and then spectacular architecture overlaid over all of that. But the ideas that people are coming up with, and having multi-use buildings next to private houses, and each one of them is not trying to up one another, but they're just trying something else, and it forms another one. And I think that grain, that is the hardest thing about planning. How do you induce that organic growth into it, right? We talked a lot about grit when we get into projects, and that grit is absent from any new project that you go see. It doesn't matter if it's in Copenhagen or in Mexico City. And then how do you introduce that grit, which means people actually stick to the place, is the biggest question.
A shout out to the translator in the back booth. This guy speaks so fast. And I am just in awe of you doing your work. So, yes.
Perhaps that allowed for the translation to catch up with Sasha. Actually, perhaps I could use your answer, which was actually a question, as a way to get to my last question before jumping into audience questions, so start thinking. You mentioned, okay, what is our responsibility, right, if I read it correctly, as designers? I think there's a lot of responsibility that you have as designers, but I think these days, in my mind, one of the biggest responsibilities is helping people to see what the future could be like, and how people can be part of their cities and help make change happen. How do you want to move on that? How do you want to inspire people to be part of their city through your design projects?
Yeah, I think for us it's a necessary and absolute required part of any project that we do. I can't think, maybe we've done a lot of public projects, but I think we never think of our client as a company or even a museum. We think of our client as the city and the people that we're building. We feel like a incredible responsibility to the communities in which we build. And we always feel more committed to the citizens that live there that will use the building than we do to any organization or any government agency that will change mayors or presidents or whatever. So I think it's an incredibly enriching part of our work. We get some of our best collaborations and advice from some community involvement. And if it's on the scale of the World Trade Center, which had the maximum community involvement, to even, I think of a museum we did in Denver, which was unusual in the States. Most museums are privately funded. And this one was actually voted on by the citizens. It was a bond issue on the ballot. Do you want a new museum? And do you want some of your taxes to go to it? And overwhelmingly, people said, yes, we do. And the result was, we had to have, I can't remember the number, it was hundreds of public meetings with the citizens. Because in that case, in my mind, I mean, we had a great director and a wonderful mayor, great head of city planning, but the citizens were the ones that said they wanted a museum. And so we would have these meetings, and the building is rather dramatic, and we would have people, hundreds of people would come, and Mr. Libeskind would stand there and answer every question until the last person left. And they would say, Mr. Lee, that's a very funny angle. Now, do you think my kid is going to hit his head on? We're like, well, of course not. Let me explain to you. But we went through every question, every debate, and actually, I have to say, it always informs what we do and makes it better. It's never something that we do just as a, oh, we need to do that. It's something we really enjoy.
I would add, but it's on a very different way of answering this question. I think this project in Red Hook that I mentioned earlier, we've done a lot of community presentations where we go, we say, okay, this is what we're proposing for this area, this is the flood protection we're proposing for that area, so the next time there's a hurricane, you don't get, inundated, etc. And every time we were leaving the meeting, their response was, am I going to get jobs? How is that going to improve my everyday life? How are my children going to get a better education? So we're talking about design, and they're talking about their life. They think that what we're going to do should help their life. This is their expectation.
And of course it should.
And of course it should. So we went back, and we were struggling with this. And, our project, FEMA covers our project. FEMA covers, every FEMA dollar has to be used for Superstorm Sandy or hurricane impact recovery and resiliency. It cannot be used for things other than that, like creating jobs, really. But so we tried to take every dollar and wrap it up with stuff that would actually make those things happen. So it changed our way of thinking about the project. So for example, now we have portions of the buildings that could benefit from some recladding. So we said, okay, let's make, and that's 32 buildings. So that's, we said, let's make some murals perhaps. So that's 32 murals. Let's have some, this is a proposition, let's have some artists come from the community, work and teach, in an apprenticeship type of artisanal ways of making tiles. So maybe each artist is working with 15 young people. They can have this training. This is job training that they can take with them. They can be paid to do this work. So we achieved we hope, two of the two major things that they asked for, like education for my children and jobs. And yet, we're doing recovery and repairs on the building. So that way of engaging with the community, I think, is really, really great. And I think, architects should take that on, listen to what the response is to your design, and maybe that helps really give back what is really needed.
Kim, perhaps the last comment on your end. So if we're listening to these two answers, they were very much about listening to the community and taking that into the design process. Yeah. Great answers both, but what I was also looking for was how can design really lead to a new level of citizen responsibility, perhaps? And there may be a nice Danish Copenhagen example.
Yeah, there's actually one on the way. I think one thing they do a lot in Copenhagen is to testing temporary things on a site. There's a very important site in the center of the city in the harbor, an island there called the Paper Island, where they used to ship paper into the newspapers. And these halls for paper, it's just been standing there, and then they started up testing different things. So they put in a guy came up with an idea about street food. So that street food thing has really evolved and become a very important thing. It's actually become the second most visited place in Copenhagen for tourists and from people from Copenhagen. And then they've had a architectural competition afterwards. But now it's evident that street food has to be part of the place in the future as well. So that's how to test it in reality.
Very nice. Good last answer. We're going to jump over to questions from the audience. And first of all, I have a question to the audience. Is Mariana still here? Oh, sorry, Kai, you still had one?
No, David, I think it's, you know, what's so great about MEXTRÓPOLI is that we are here, Van Alen International Council, because of this festival. This is the opportunity for us to kind of engage and to tell you our stories and to listen to your stories. So there are 5 offices represented right here, but I'd like to do also quickly tell you of offices that are actually sitting amongst you. We have haptic architects right here in the front. We have Snøhetta architects sitting sort of in the middle. Just raise your hands if you can, or don't.
No, he's already on the...
He left.
We have Silman Shop. Shop. We have Silman Engineering. We have Paycob Fried, that's sitting right there. We have Olsen Kundig sitting over here, passively putting their hands up. We have White Architects. We have Vingård Architects. And I think everyone, I hope, is actually mentioned. Snøhetta didn't. They left. Exactly. Sorry.
And Jan Gil Studio.
And Jan Gale was here as well. And it's, I think, even in the question and answer session, I think it would be wonderful if the questions, of course, can be directed towards us, but also if you have questions actually for any of the group members, it would be wonderful.
So as you see, we always try to make it more difficult as we go. Thank you. Exactly, great. Mariana, I'm going to ask you if you could help with 2 things with your colleagues. Could you help roam a microphone around the room? And I'm not sure, it may help, some people may feel hesitant to speak up in English. So if people want to ask something in Spanish, perhaps Mariana, you would be able to... Great, we have a translator here. Fantastic. With the questions, I'm going to ask you one thing. It's always, of course, super tempting to ask exactly what each of these firms is up to and what their next project is and all of that. That's why we're doing cocktails, or they will be hanging out after the panel. I would love to have some questions from you about the topic that we've been chatting about today. So how do these projects, design projects, impact people? And secondly, and perhaps most importantly, how can we as people have an impact on the city? So keep that in the back of your minds when you're asking your questions. Who got the first one?
¿Alguna pregunta? ¿Alguien? A ver, de este lado. ¿En inglés o en español? ¿En inglés? Ok.
So, I do believe Mexico is an extraordinary city, but Mexico as a country is having a lot of problems nowadays. And I would like to ask if you believe there's a way in designing public space that encourages people to speak up, to be involved, and to be brave enough to demand change.
Very nice one, and clearly listen to the panel. Very good.
Who wants to start?
One of my most favorite projects of the last 10 years is Jürgen Meyer's covered plaza in Seville, Spain, Sevilla. It is bringing attention to a public space, and it is re-energizing that public space. So when there were those huge demonstrations just a few years ago, the city felt empowered, the youth felt empowered to go to that space as opposed to any other space in the city to actually demand change. So I think you could maybe have spaces that are kind of underutilized, and maybe there are projects of bringing kind of a new energy into the spaces that you have here in Mexico, in all of the other cities.
I have a comment regarding that. That project was hugely contested, and people didn't like it. So why?
Start from the beginning. I'm not sure if everybody heard your beginning.
Okay, that project was very controversial in Seville because people actually didn't like it at the beginning. They were protesting against it. So what about the idea of maybe prototyping or prototyping something to build consensus and then build a building that everybody likes?
So that's a nice one. Perhaps first of all, are you from Seville? Because it's nice to get more context in that case.
I'm from Baja California.
Ah, okay.
So, I'm sorry, I'm not going to speak all the time, but we did the prototyping actually in New York City.
Mm-hmm.
Times Square was no square. It was all cars. And one of the groups that is in the Van Alen group actually started, and Jan Gale and Snøhetta, two of the groups in the Van Alen groups, actually started to prototype the Times Square as a pedestrian place. Because what they mapped out, Jan Gale mapped out that 80% of the people were using 5% of the space in the square, on the sidewalks. And then they flipped it, and they said, let's give 80% of the space to the people, and the 20% to the cars. And they then stretched that down Broadway. So suddenly 30 blocks of downtown Manhattan is going through a massive change. So I think the prototyping idea is a brilliant one, and we should use we should do more of.
Any nice examples, prototyping examples that you want to bring up, group?
No, but I think the question that was asked initially might be an inspiration for all of you guys to get together and figure out what it is. If it is about speaking up, maybe architects can be instrumental in how you do that, how you create a place that allows for that, whether it's a podium or a hidden podium. I always go back to, I can't remember whose ad it is, and I'm not sure if it's running in Mexico, but it's a black screen showing people hugging and kissing behind it, and the couples then come out, and you never know if it's going to be a same sex or not, or what you're seeing, because all you're seeing is the silhouettes, right? And it's that expectation that's building up in that, and I think that's what you're talking about. Is there a way for us to create places where we can speak from without necessarily feeling vulnerable? Back to you.
Going back to that question, I mean, I felt this is something we talked about earlier as a group, that if you compare, for example, plazas or open spaces in Mexico City versus in New York City, one big difference is that the spaces in Mexico City seem to be really truly open in terms of their programming, and they're being occupied and used in ways that are perhaps unprogrammed, like we're walking down and then we see somebody puts music and then there's a salsa party happening, or like here there's somebody selling, juice or whatever. It's like very organic, and it seems to be very free. The open space at UNAM, we went to the university also, very free kind of open space. In New York City, for example, the parks suffer, I think, from over-programming. In Bryant Park, you go and here's where you play bocce ball. Here's the open reading area. Here's the ping pong area. Here's where you can do some juggling, really. I mean, everything seems to be very highly structured, and the few spaces that are not, there has been protests that take place there. Like there's one area in Union Square, if you're familiar with New York City, which is unprogrammed, and that's where, if there is going to be a small demonstration, that's where they're going to be. Or Occupy Wall Street, big, large areas, and that is where those demonstrations happen. So I'm not so sure how tied it is, and this is, I guess, a question back to you. I'm not so sure how tied it is to actual space making. It's more about the stuff around it, the programming around it. Or maybe it's a cultural attitude towards open space.
Let's see if anybody wants to jump off from that point.
Empowered by innovation.
I wanted to say something about it. luckily it was not my computer, but I always have a fear of like doing a presentation and everybody seeing your desktop. Mine is much worse than that. Let's see, what other questions do we have?
Going back to Hana's comment, I think you hit it in the nail again. You know, I think the best success for building is when the building is actually used as it is not intended. You know, I think the most successful buildings, as you've seen across times, are the ones that just keep transforming. The building does not change; the use might change. You know, it might be a church, it might be a market, or whatever. You know, the use or the new government makes it, or the people make it to happen. But going back to the public space, I think the most successful public spaces are the ones that you mentioned, right? In Mexico, I think there's the sense of having things are very, very casual, they're very unstructured, you know, and Mexicans will just take advantage of every single space they have, especially when it comes to public space, because we don't have that many. So we make the most out of them. And I think in other cultures, they're so restrictive and everything has to be so controlled and so organized, and you know, especially in other countries like the United States, you said, or maybe some other European countries, that I think for public spaces to be successful, architects they need to, I think, or I believe they need to be able to allow for these things to happen. I don't know what you think, but I think that's something like you mentioned right now. It's something that's very, very, very important.
Since we're doing introductions of the whole audience, this was actually Gerardo Salinas, who has been a friend of the council and has been with us for the past days, and also really encourage you to have a good chat with Gerardo, who has been outside of Mexico for a long time, but back these days and doing great work. Let's see, any more questions? Cocktails. One last question before we go to cocktails, Kai.
A little bit about the global communities. We kind of know that maybe 2% of the architects are the ones in charge of designing for the population. No? We resolve 2% of the population in the world. And this happens more in Latin America, right? This is why we grow up without any control or any planning. So I just would like to ask if you guys have any kind of example of a project that made any difference in between working with the people, designing with the people, or for the people. No? What is the difference between when you have a project that you make proposals to the people and you plan for them and tell them what it should be or how their city should be, and the difference between doing this or asking the people what they need? I don't know if...
It's a nice one, actually, and fits in very nicely with the panel. So, is your work different, or is the outcome very different if you're working without any consultation, without conversations, from when you do a very extensive process with the communities that you're working? I don't think for, but I really think in an ideal scenario working with. But let's see what you guys have there.
I guess I would just reiterate that I don't think, I can't remember a project that we ever did that we said, do you like it? You know, so I think that in every project there's, even if it's informal or if it's formalized by the agency we're working with or with a client we're working with, I feel like it's always the most important part of a project. And maybe it's the situation we're in where we travel around and we work in many different places all over the world, that we always feel like we have something to learn, and we always know that we can bring some ideas or stimulate conversations, but that we've never done a project where we didn't engage the community in some way, shape, or form. And I think it's absolutely critical for our work. It's not an exercise that we do, and I think that it's the only way to start to understand, and we can maybe ask different questions as an outsider, sometimes in a new place, and get answers that are unexpected as well. And I think that just going back to this idea about planning versus not planning and what's the role of planning, and I think, we can all point to examples like we were discussing today, Paris, the most planned city in the world, which is beautiful. And then Mexico City, which we've all been enamored with, the kind of organic and exciting and vibrant, less planned and more organic development. And I think that the answer isn't one or the other, it's both. In a way, in history, we always need one set of ideas, and then we certainly like to, react to those or disrupt those orders. And so I think it's always a balance about, you need both. You need the order, and then you need the disruption or the other conversation.
Yeah, no, I agree with you, but I go back also to what Kai said about having a vision, and I think that you both have to learn from the community you're designing for, but the community also has to learn from you. There's an education process that needs to happen. So I think that the architect or the group of architects working on a master plan, let's just say, has a vision, shares that vision, but it's not a vision that says, here's what I imagine this to be. It's more a vision about a process, let's say, right? And then there's a back and forth. There's an education process where I think the community, you're never going to please everybody, right? But if the community is involved and is also educated at the same time, they're educating you, you're educating them, so they understand why and how you're making certain decisions a certain way. It's not that you like it, you want to make it pink because you like pink. You're doing it because this is where it comes from. You kind of like open up and become more transparent about your process. They then have a stake in it. And it's very likely that they will take care of whatever you build for them, whether it's a plaza or a building, etc. And they will feel like this is also their work. They have their fingerprint in it. It's part of how they think it should have been, the outcome.
I wanted to, sorry to interrupt, but I wanted to offer kind of like a
Where
counterpoint.
are you?
Over here.
Where are you?
A counterpoint to Libeskind office, where, well, apparently, you have been involved in projects where there's community engagement, but then you're also well known for high-profile projects like just to point out an example, the Crystals Plaza in Las Vegas would be one that I could think of. So maybe I think what the question, what I got from the question that I heard is what's the difference between where there is the opportunity of community engagement and then having to answer to, yeah.
Of course, yeah, it's a great question. Maybe I can answer that. That's a project I worked on. Oh, you can answer it. Sure, you can. No, but that's a really great question, and I think it goes back to what I said. Our client, and don't tell MGM, but our client is the people that will come there. And that's a really great example because it's a very unique place where many, many, many different people come. There are the citizens that live there, but it's also a very tourist place, right? And I think with that project in particular, what we cared the most about in MGM was very open to ideas from architects, that we said, for example, most of the casinos in Las Vegas or the retail portions in any other casino that you see, they all have no windows. This goes back to my dad, I guess. But they make, what was it at the Caesar's Palace where they have the fake trompe-l'oeil sky above. And what they're trying to do is disorient you. So you think, oh, I'll just spend money. I won't look out the beautiful window. And that's a theory in retail. It's the same in the casinos, right? They want you to have the lights dim, get the free cocktails, and keep giving them your money, right? And I'm not saying that as a criticism of that, but I think that for us, in doing that project in Las Vegas, the first thing we said was we've got to take the energy from these streets because it's one place in America where people really walk up and down the streets. It's a very lively, boisterous atmosphere. Maybe because you can drink outside, on the street, which most places you can't. But how do we create? And we knew who our client was, and we knew they had ambition to make something different. And we also knew that the retailers in that complex, who they were aiming for, Louis Vuitton, Prada. I can't shop there, So how do we make this something for everybody and not just for the actual client or the actual person who they're trying to bring in for the shopping? So it's all about the public space. It's all about, we have skylights, we have this dramatic spiraling form that comes in that actually brings the light of Las Vegas into this retail portion, and it's got some of those beautiful desert skies. It will be all pink in there, bright and early in the morning. And so, again, I think it's different on every project, but in that one, we did break a lot of the rules of what a client might be looking for, and they embraced it, which made them a great client, but it's really what drove our work. You know, we created a gathering space. They now have like ballet performances in there and cultural events and musicians, and it's a great gathering space as well. So I think that's a great question.
Okay, short last answer, Sasha.
On the flip side, the cities are likely the largest experiments that we as a humankind have undertook over the last few thousands of years, and I think we should think of them as such and take them as such. And one thing is that we don't know what we don't know, and people that we work with don't know what they don't know. And I think that's the richness of or beauty of being an architect, if you wish, or a planner, is you're always delving into an area of unknown. And I think we need to embrace that messiness of life or world that surrounds us, and not shoot for absolute answers, but shoot for nudges, right? Nudging left or nudging right or nudging forward, nudging backwards, and test. And if we can embrace that, I think that might create richness that we're all enjoying here in Mexico City.
Well, it's actually a very nice point to end on. Sometimes I wonder, like, if in school we should be asking much more about how we could not only create great designs that we learn about through interaction with communities and clients, but also how do you really communicate with your with the constituencies around us. And that's a thing that you need to push for, as especially I think there's a lot of students in the room. This is what you need to push for with your professors, I feel. Perhaps to wrap up, well, Dutch guys actually get hungry early, so I'm way over my limit, which is still too early here likely. But I think the important thing to take away from this conversation is several things. So first of all, to go back to the main two themes of the evening. Or cities can be changed by all of us, but also very importantly, we can help change the cities around us. And it's not only about the cities, but also about the architecture in those cities, of course. With that in mind, I think it's very, very important to realize as designers you have a huge responsibility to allow for change to happen. And very importantly, for people to see things differently. Inspire people a little bit and help them see much more further into the future. So, having that said, I would like to wrap up. Thank the 5 of you for great comments. Glad to have you here tonight. Glad to have the rest of the International Council here also. Make sure all of you in the audience to chat with all of them. The great folks will be outside for a little bit longer. And yeah, thank you all for coming tonight.
Muchas gracias a todos por venir. Nada más les recordamos que mañana vamos a seguir teniendo actividades. En el teatro vamos a estar de 9 a 5 de la tarde. Y durante las tardes, al igual que hoy, tendremos diálogos simultáneos en el Mucho. Aquí en el Franz Mayer repetiremos diálogo, innovación en el espacio público. Muchas gracias.